So in this, sorry, I'm hearing sounds here. Let me know if I should continue. Okay, so I'll continue. Thanks very much, Nicolas. In this session, so we'll seek to understand the specific institutional context of Minister of Finance for such a scenario exercise. And we'll have Luis Pereira da Silva from Sciences Po and LSE, who will give us the rationale for this missing macro leg in the global climate agenda, why Ministers of Finance should coordinate on scenarios. We'll also hear perspectives and experience from a diverse set of stakeholders, starting with Ministers of Finance themselves. And we welcome Sam Mugume from Uganda and current co-chair, deputy co-chair of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. We'll hear also from Nicola Picciotino as head of the International Development Finance Club and giving us the point of view of development banks in this area of climate and nature scenarios. And Santiago Lorenzo, head of climate at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And we'll finally also hear from the knowledge side, the science side. We have the chance to have Stuart Brocklehurst, Deputy Vice Chancellor at Exeter University, a leading academic hub on climate science, on tipping points, but also on economic policy scenarios. And he will say more about what Exeter University is doing with partners across global north and south on these issues. And last but not least, Laura Carvalho from the Open Society Foundation and also Sao Paulo University will tell us about the importance of green industrial strategies in those scenarios and how ministers of finance can coordinate this integrative policy framework that would foster green development and bring developing and emerging countries on board with the transition agenda. So without further more introduction, I will welcome Luis Pereira da Silva for opening remarks. Luis, you're in the room. I can see you, and I know there is not enough space on stage, but yeah. Okay, great, amazing. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Very well here.
Hi.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here and introduce this panel. So it's about making the case for macroeconomic scenarios for ministers of finance. Why is it so important? Let me make 3 points here. First, take the example of the benefits for central banks that having homogeneous scenarios by the network for greening the financial system brought in terms of policy design, in terms of homogenizing the monetary policies across the community of central banks. You may remember that it's because the production of macroeconomic scenarios that were common for central banks that the agenda of greening the financial system and of building policies that would be consistent globally and locally was made possible. The second point, it's important to have a combination through macroeconomic scenarios future because there is inevitably a necessary financial dialogue between central banks and ministers of finance. And for that dialogue to materialize in a consistent way, you do need to have homogeneous macroeconomic parameters because the policy mix that will be built at a national level will inevitably make an interaction between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you think of the impact of climate on inflation, this is called greenflation. It is, of course, something that is in the domain of central banks. But if central banks react in a too much aggressive to greenflation by raising interest rates, inevitably this will have an impact on public finance because the cost of public debt will rise. And therefore, the fiscal room for maneuver for implementing adaptation and mitigation policies will diminish. So there is a need when you have, and we are having green inflation, we will have inflation of cost. It is a supply shock. We have a lot of applauses in the audience here, so it's nice. Well, you do need this coordination. Another example, when you have a strategy for issuing green bonds by the Treasury, this is typically a Treasury issue. However, if you have at the same time a policy by the central bank that is acceptable in terms of putting a collateral monetary policy that incorporates sovereign green bonds into their portfolio, inevitably you have to talk between central banks and ministers of finance to design, propose, size up the emission of such green. So this is another example where it's important for ministers of finance to have a scenario. It's important for them to coordinate with their respective central banks. And of course, because I was in both positions, I was in ministers of finance and I was also in central banking, I can understand there is sometimes resistance. People like to be independent. People like to sort of do things by themselves. However, it is not an optimal policy not to talk to each other. And my final and third remark here before I leave for the panelists is that yes, it's important to have scenarios for ministers of finance, but you need to distinguish between the room for maneuver of countries. It is not the same if you are a Ministry of Finance in a middle income country that is an investment grade, because of course, as you know, if you are an investment grade, you have market access in international capital markets, you have a much more stable foreign exchange policy, you have more reserves, etc., etc. Therefore, you have to separate between categories of countries. Inevitably doesn't mean any judgment of value about that. It's just to measure the room for maneuver for policy. So, investment grade middle income countries, you can have, let's say, a number of instruments at your disposal. If you are sub investment grade, of course, you have also to engineer policies, but probably you will have to rely much more on a cooperation with, for example, the multilateral development bank system, so that, for example, they can provide you with the necessary guarantees to mitigate the risk of your, for example, your government paper. Finally, of course, the situation of low-income countries is more difficult, more dependent precisely on climate finance, on concessional financing, and therefore the calibration and the availability of instruments will be different. So again, I close here. Three good reasons for have scenarios, and I wish you now I pass the panel for the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Luis. The idea was to then move to some of the key actors, key players that you mentioned, Luis. So we don't have people representing the central banks, but we have ministers of finance and we have also public development banks, which you did not mention there. And I think that the interaction between the two is also critical in building these scenarios. But let's start maybe with Sam Mugume from the Ministry of Finance of Uganda, and as I said, deputy co-chair of the Global Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, for a few words on why climate and nature economic policy scenarios could be a useful implementation tool after COP30. So the floor is yours, Sam.
Thank you so much, Etienne. It's my pleasure really to be invited here to this panel and to talk about this subject really that is very critical for us. I want to thank the keynote really that defined what we're doing with the scenarios, nature macroeconomic relation scenario, both for Ministry of Finance, central banks, and development banks, which is very, very, very critical. And for us in the Ministry of Finance, it's a new experience, definitely. Because we've been grappling a lot hard to understand the impact of climate shocks and what on macroeconomic objectives and both physical and monetary, which you explained in terms of the physical space and the revenue. And we think we're moving a little. But you know, the big fact is that most of our economies depend on natural capital, and this is nature and biodiversity. So to understand critically what the future is going to be, depending what they use in terms of numbers, is critical for Minister of Finance for physical macro physical frameworks, both long term and medium term, but also for central banks, like was explained in the keynote address. So it's very, very critical and something we would like to take up. This is an initiative that we really want to encourage. And for us to be able to understand it well is critical. So I can in explaining what I was said from Uganda, Minister of Finance, Macroeconomic Department. Number one is like you said, there's definitely need for coordination. Minister of Finance, central banks, but again with the science-based sectors, Minister of Water and Environment, because they understand the natural capital better. If we're talking about nature and biodiversity, they know the estimation and the evaluation is going to come from there. Natural capital accounting here handy. And these are things that we must be able to think to give us the numbers for simulations, which are very, very critical in understanding the capital we have and the rest. And the data itself. So this is a big innovation. It's a big thing that we take up as a country. At coalition level, we are 100 member countries. And all we do is share experience. Number one, to understand, like we're understanding it, which we take it up. Also to work with institutional partners and among us ourselves to share the best experiences, peer learning, capacity building, and enhancement. Capacity in terms of understanding nature and biodiversity when it comes to Ministry of Finance is lacking. So these are things that we should be able to look at and in detail, both for the technical output, but also for the understanding of reports and the simulations to make us plan well for the future and provide the funding. I want to stop here, Etienne, and probably I'll come in later. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sam. And yeah, we often see that the role of Minister of Finance is to navigate between different types of shocks, including more and more climate shocks and transition types of shocks in the coming period, and that feeds into also geo-economic tensions. Now, one institution that quite often works for ministers of finance, but looks at the more long-term and structural transformation aspect of things is the public development banks. And we have here Nicola Picciotino, head of the IDFC network of public development banks, to say a few words on how he sees the role of scenarios and coordinated scenarios to push for more coordinated action between Ministers of Finance and public development banks. Nicola.
Yes, thank you. so much, Etienne, and very happy to host everyone, all these distinguished speakers on our pavilion. Let me first recall what IDFC and Finance in Common is. IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, is a club of 27 public development banks, mostly national and regional. We are the biggest provider of climate finance in the world, $200 billion on average of climate finance every year, and we are actually the founding member of the broader Finance in Common coalition, representing the 536 public development banks. Just one figure, those 536 public development banks, every year they issue $2.5 trillion of financing. Of course, not all of it is climate, but imagine if we could green those flows. I think we have won the war against climate change. And of course, as you said, public development banks are public entities, and so depending greatly and generally only from the Ministries of Finance. This is why coordination is so important. There is a strong momentum with the public development banks. You have all read, I hope, the Compromiso di Sevilla after the Sevilla Conference Financing for Development #4, during which there was two important paragraphs for us. The first one being paragraph 30, in which there is a call for the states to better rely on their national development banks, and for the countries where there is no banks to create one. And the paragraph 37 on how to better work as a system, relying on the cooperative advantages of all those public development banks. And we mentioned the multilateral development banks. They should, because they have access to concessional and long-term financing, finance those who are on the ground, notably the national and the subnational development banks that knows the specificities of the project and the countries they want to invest in. And yes, the public development banks, they can help the states and the countries to implement public policies. And that's why, because also we rely a lot on financing climate, it's super important to be integrated and to better cooperate with all this ecosystem, to better understand what could be the risk and the shock when it comes to climate and biodiversity. We are building scenarios, and we need to better discuss and better cooperate all together. There is a strong momentum at the moment around country-led strategies, what we call the country platforms. In 2 days, there will be a lot of announcements, and of course, we are supporting those ideas with an idea, an objective is to better scale up the example of Brazil, which was the first country who launched a country platform, having the national development banks, BNDES, at the center of it, implementing the project, originating the project, but also better channeling the funds coming from the multilateral development banks, but also the private sector. So I don't want to be too long, but of course we are very, very interested in participating in building public policy scenarios for climate and nature with the Ministries of Finance, and I'm super happy to share this panel with my good friend Sam, of course, and the cooperation is already existing, but we want to continue to have it and to be part of this ecosystem, and very happy to continue the discussion.
Thanks, thanks very much, Nicolas. So we've heard about the kind of strategic role ministers of finance have in coordination with central banks, thanks to Luis, to respond to their own direct mandate with Sam, and also supervising the strategies of public development banks when there are some in the countries with Nicolas. One question when we build scenarios now is what the relevant geographical scale or scope, and is there a meaningful way to approach scenarios at global or more regional scale? And maybe to say a word on that, we have the chance to have Santiago Lorenzo from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. CEPAL has lots of credibility with all the country members in Latin America, and has accumulated lots of knowledge on climate, economic policy issues, already engaging with ministers of finance a lot in this area. So how do you view the possibility or the perspectives to build such climate, nature, economic policy scenarios for Ministers of Finance in the region. Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Paradoxically, I want to start talking about central banks and then landing in ministers of finance. We start working with the central banks long ago, when the NGFS started. Actually, Mexico was one of the founders of that, so they asked us for support, and we start working with that. And they wanted to make a more granular approach from the NGFS scenarios, and we have been supporting the work by the Mexican Central Bank for it's around 4 years now, with the GCAM, the GEMS, and the Clean Risk, 3 models, bridging them to talk each other, because the NGFS modeling was more about mitigation aspects of the scenario building, and Mexico has transition risk, no doubt. It's an oil producer, but also is very vulnerable to climate change. So in that regard, the physical risk also were very important to model. So we started with them. We have developed a very interesting analytical tools with them, and also 2 years ago, a little bit more, 3 years ago, the dialogue with the Minister of Finance in Mexico also started, and it's interesting how to do this. The macroeconomic impacts of climate change are the same for one or the other Minister of Finance or central banks. The translation to the mandate of each one is different, and that's where probably you create a differential bring the information relevant for each one. But the macroeconomy is the same one. The same one is the Mexican macroeconomy. So in that regard, they were interested to join forces. Also, it's interesting that for the mandate of the central bank, is the first one is price control, and you were, Luis, about climflation, and that's something that it's really outstanding from the modeling. In Mexico, it is identified that the basic basket for the price level is pushed up by food since the early century. And now with climate change, it's going to get worse. So the importance to understand how climate influence will push inflation because of food is a critical issue. And also, if they can influence with this concern the Minister of Finance to have better policies for adaptation in the agricultural and stock sector, it's also relevant. So the conversation goes beyond what is the mandate originally, and that gives us a floor for exchanging views that is important. Also, the central banks have usually more stable and more staff for research, and more time to deal with the research required by modeling, and the ministers of finance are in the rush every single day to deal with different issues. So the support on the concrete outcomes that are required for policies with the capacity of research of the central banks, if you can merge or not merge but coordinate, articulate the two institutions, this is a win-win definitively. So that's how far we are going with them. But also an interesting derivation of this work is in Central America. We are also working with 8 countries including Dominican Republic, and we are working with both, with ministers of finance and central bankers of the 2 regions, and is much vulnerable than there is not such important challenge for transition risk, but for physical risk much more. So we are already working with them on that aspect, and now also one thing that came from with Samuel was yesterday talking in another side event about how manage properly the debt you also were talking, Luis. That's also important for this modeling for the region. The region is has a GDP related burden of the debt of 78% of the GDP, and the service of debt is like around percent of the public of the income, is the fiscal income. So to understand how to deal with debt restructuring in investing in the transformation of the economy is also a critical role for this modeling. So interestingly, there is a lot of interest in the region. We are supporting Brazil also on assessing the consequences of the CBAM of the European Union in their exports. The research is ongoing, and soon we will have some results. And well, we were working with the team of Etienne in C3A on that regard. We will continue working with different partners. This demand in the region, much more interest every single day. We're talking with some. We will be coordinating also with the coalition, and yes, there is a lot of challenges because everybody's learning at some point, and there is challenges, the technical challenges, methodological challenge, but also in the governance of the efforts, and that's something that it can. There is a common sense that we need to come together, and I think there is a conversation with the of the coalition with the NGFS that will help a lot on that. I leave it there, but open to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Santiago, for all these examples in Mexico, Central America, Brazil, of already existing technical collaboration between the Minister of Finance and central banks on these climate issues / scenarios. And of course, given all the work that the NGFS has been doing already on scenarios, we have to reflect and think about what can be used from this work, how the process works, how it was structured, and how that can translate into Minister of Finance. There are maybe two topics that were not actually part of what the NGFS did yet, also for good reasons because of the mandate of central banks. One, I think, is the policies, and we know central banks want to remain neutral, as neutral as possible in terms of the policy issues. So, but Minister of Finance can't be neutral there. They have to decide on policies. So all the policy mixes, the question of green industrial strategies, tax issues, debt sustainability strategies, that will be part necessarily of a scenario exercise with Minister of Finance. And the other topic, maybe that was a bit less handled by central banks, is the question of instabilities of the climate system, tipping points. And so it's good because we have two experts, one on the green industrial strategies part, Laura Cavallo, and one on the tipping points science world with the Exeter University representative, Stuart Brocklehurst. So let's maybe start with the science, the climate science parts. Stuart, if you want to say a few words on how Exeter University contributes with other global North and South institutions to improve climate science on tipping points and forecasting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Etienne. I think there's a natural human tendency to expect linear change. We look at a graph of performance to date going like this, and in our minds, we tend to think, well, it'll carry on at roughly the same way. We don't tend to instinctively always imagine or accept the disruptive change. But before I came into academia, I was a banker. And in banking, you were very interested in that sudden rapid change, whether it was a disaster that meant that your loan had gone bad, you'd lost your investment, there was a catastrophic insurance payout, or whether it's positive, you'd got into an industry at the right time and the investment took off in a very sharp way. And for scenario planning around climate change, it's absolutely vital to understand that change will not be linear. And this comes from climate tipping points. A tipping point essentially is when you move from one stable state which becomes unstable and transitions into another. So we have tipping points in planetary systems, and we're approaching quite a number of these now. So for example, this is when, because of rising CO2 emissions, we have global warming, which triggers global forest fires at a higher intensity, which releases more carbon dioxide, which causes more global warming, which creates more forest fires. And you have this very rapid accelerating system. And there are a number of these systems which unfortunately can interrelate and reinforce each other and mean that we have to be prepared. And in scenario planning, we have to be ready to look at very disruptive change. But tipping points don't just come in planetary systems. They also can come in geopolitics. They can come in financial markets. And really importantly, there are positive tipping points in the transitional industries where you see a technology that previously was expensive, was niche, reach a scale which reduces its cost and accelerates its take-up and rollout. So these mix of tipping points are really essential to understanding how we plan scenarios for climate change. And to explain a little context on the University of Exeter, we have 1,500 staff working on climate and nature. We work very closely with the British Met Office, which is based in Exeter, home to the Global Carbon Budget, which is published today, to Global Tipping Points, led by Tim Lenton, Exeter Climate Policy Team, led by Jean-Francois Mercure. And this work together, bringing together policy and tipping points, is key. I'm struck by the fact that of all our climate research, the area where financial institutions, banks, investment managers, insurers are most interested in tipping points, in understanding and foreseeing how there will be disruptive change ahead, positive and negative. And we get a lot of demand from those institutions to advise them on that. And with Jean-Francois' work, I think this translation into scenario planning, not just for financial institutions, but for central banks and for finance ministries, is absolutely vital. And we're very pleased to work with our good friends at Agence Française de Développement, apologies for my poor pronunciation, and with other partners to take this work and to help support the challenging task of development banks, of finance ministries. It's the life of COP, isn't it? Always.
Yes.
Hello. I think we're back on this one. Good. Okay. So just to conclude, to say that yes, this is important for financial institutions, but equally, really, it's gone dead again. Does this? Nope. Neither of them. I'll try and stereo. No. Okay.
I can hear you, huh? Stuart.
I think this one is back. I think, frankly, I'd concluded my comments. So I think I'll pass the mic to Laura and invite Etienne to introduce her.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And sorry for the incident here, but I think you laid out quite well how much we need to integrate these non-linearities because they matter. It's not just for the beauty of better science. It's because they matter directly to what Minister of Finance have to what type of shocks Minister of Finance have to tackle. So I think that these are very essential perspectives for scenario building for Minister of Finance. Now moving to the critical issue of the policy mixes and what kind of blends of policies should be mobilized by countries, depending, of course, on their structural characteristics, and in particular the need for green industrial diversification and development. We have the chance to have Laura Cavallo here. The floor is yours, and take your time.
Thank you, Etienne. Yes, so I think the short point I want to make here has to do with the role that these scenarios and that proper modeling by ministries of finance can take, not in coordination with central banks, which I think has been addressed by others, or even public development banks, but as a coordinator for the integrated agenda that climate increasingly has with development strategies and social policies, educational policies. Increasingly so, climate is everywhere in the government, and governments are taking a role of leading not only the climate transition, but also integrating that climate transition with multiple goals, with jobs, with inequality reduction, with industrialization, and moving up value chains, right? And so if you take the example of Brazil, if you go to every ministry, they're gonna have a secretariat under them that is looking at climate, right? And of course, this is reflected in the NDCs, which is already an effort of integration from a climate perspective, but from an economic perspective and a policy choice perspective, I think ministries of finance are the ones that have a mandate to act as a coordinator, not only in looking at all these multiple objectives at once, but also, as Tinbergen also always put forward, if you have multiple objectives, you need multiple tools. And so increasingly so, you are relying on various different types of tools that are used for those multiple objectives as part of this agenda. It is really a planning agenda, right? And I want to recover that word planning, which has been out of fashion for so long, right? But in fact, if you talk to climate scientists, the type of time horizon that they have in mind, combined with the fact that they're discussing a whole of economy transformation, technological transformation, structural change. This is really, in a way, an opportunity for governments to recover their capacity to plan. If they need to plan for climate, they can plan for development. And so how can ministries of finance use that type of modeling to really regain the capacity to plan? And it's not just ministries of finance that are going to do that alone. Of course, most governments have ministries of planning. They have development banks that are dealing with the long term by nature. But I think there is a role that this modeling and the impact across different goals and economic indicators by different tools that are used, I think can play a role of regaining that planning capacity. And so a lot of people talk about the climate transition as an economic opportunity. And of course, there are concrete economic opportunities in each country by entering specific sectors that are part of that transition at the global level. But I think there is something more fundamental that the climate transition offers as an opportunity, which is really how governments can, again, have that type of long-term thinking and integration across areas that has been so long lost by, I would say, neoliberal types of policies. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Thanks a lot, Laura. I think you touched two things here. The multiple objectives require multiple tools. And of course, Ministers of Finance need to understand what kind of combinations lead to what kind of effect. And the second thing I think is very interesting is how scenario exercise, which is not pure modeling, it's also like just prospective thinking in different possible futures, can help actually change the role and the mandates of the institutions at the same time by aligning the incentives towards shared goal and longer term horizon. So that's kind of the transformative power of scenarios potentially. So I want to maybe come back to Luis for a few reflections on what has been said. I think very brilliantly by our speakers on many different aspects of this question of scenario building. Luis, if you have a few words.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this panel. I think you got sort of a glimpse of the many aspects that are needed in terms of having scenarios for ministers of finance. I think an important aspect is the regional coordination that was mentioning. The second aspect is to take into account in scenarios the need to consider disruptions, to see that these are not linear scenarios as we are supposed to think traditionally. Precisely the capacity of scenarios is to be capable or make the general public, but also agencies in government understand that there is disruption. Then the idea that you need necessarily to have clubs and coordinations between public institutions. And also it was mentioned the need to have the capacity internally in countries to coordinate within agencies, and to have also specific cases, particularly it was mentioning the case of countries in the Sub-Saharan African continent. Finally, I think the important idea is not only to have coordination in terms of the dialogue between central banks, ministers of finance, ministers of the environment, but the general idea that the process of building scenarios is a necessary and important tool for planning. And planning not in the old sense of traditional 20th century type of mandates, but the idea of being capable of understanding what is the type of market-based coordination with also some direct public investment financed by public agencies that will sort of create a direction for society and for the economy. So thank you very much for attending this. And Etienne, up to you for the final word.
Thanks very much, Luis. I wanted to ask maybe quickly, Sam. So are we? Is that the beginning of a new adventure for Ministers of Finance?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect yes. The answer is yes. Again, yes and yes and yes. And we are converted. We think this is we should do it. I like the point of it's not going to be the real trend. We expect some shocks, and we should understand this. We need to take it on as countries. I like the regional thinking. Africa, we're starting a regional platform for Minister of Finance. Seated here, I was thinking, can we add on central banks and then make it bigger? So those are the thinking that but it should be regional and global, and making sure we have the data and be able to disseminate this properly. Let's start now, Etienne, and everybody. I thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks everyone. Just a few last points. There are some following up moments. On December 10 in Paris, you'll receive some invitation for a whole day workshop on this question of scenarios for Ministers of Finance, and that will be in partnership with the coalition, with NGFS, with FIX, that we intend to organize this. Then regional work will start as well, and I think Sam, you mentioned this African platform. You have this meeting on December 16 to 18, and there will be work starting at the regional level on scenarios, and hopefully also early 26 in collaboration with CEPAL for Latin American Ministers of Finance in Mexico. And we hope also to mobilize the centers of excellence such as Exeter and other universities. And maybe worth mentioning, we'll probably have a big moment at Exeter University in June 26 or July, I don't remember, but that will be cleared. And of course, there will be a Zoom, particular focus on this new initiative. So looking forward to working with all of you on this this important agenda. Thanks again very much, everyone, and we just need a photo to finalize this moment.